was elected to the presidency, he installed Louis Giuffrida as head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Giuffrida was an old cold warrior from Reagan's California days whose specialty was suppression of unrest and dissent. Giuffrida, North, and George Bush began to turn FEMA into an instrument of domestic anti-terrorism.
You're dealing with a group of people in the Reagan administration who equated political dissent with treason, and who cannot differentiate between emergency procedures, which I think everyone agrees are necessary, and suppressing political dissent. And with North and Poindexter and Casey, you had a group of people who saw Americans who disagree with them as the enemy.
Without enhanced interrogation, there is no bin Laden. True or false, Mr. Ollie North?
Well, the folks that are currently resident down in Gitmo wouldn't be there but for what Gina Haspel and her brave colleagues did. Look, Gina Haspel is the person needed to head the CIA in this New World Disorder. Without going through all the litany of what you went through at the very beginning of this broadcast, this woman spent 30 years as an operations officer with numerous foreign postings. She is, quite frankly, admired by most of her colleagues. I've not talked to anybody at the headquarters currently or who was there who know her, who don't think the world of her. Dianne Feinstein ought to retire now. Look, she's grandstanding about waterboarding when it was deemed to be legal by the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, and the President of the United States. In other words, she did her duty. It was only afterwards that they decided it really wasn't lawful. And I think I know a little bit about what it's like. What happens to people who do their duty and Congress disagrees?
Congressman, Colonel, rather, have you been waterboarded in your life and your career in the military as a Marine that served his country and had to have a Purple Heart or two? I think two.
Look, I was a SERE instructor, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. I used to teach it. I was waterboarded when I went through the course. I waterboarded at least 150 people, some of whom I'm sure are right now wondering what the heck was going on, because it was all legal before. We used to do it for training. We used to do it to people when you need to be prepared for this kind of thing. I guess that was all stopped as well now. Look, all that ended for me. I hope it ends well for the new DCI, Gina Haspel.
Now, the key has been, in their planning, has been a war. A war, you have a national, security emergency. You can declare martial law. You can take emergency measures in war that you can't argue in peacetime centers.
Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman,
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe it was.
May I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
and tragically, the only member who got close was Jack Brooks, and he was stopped by the church.
When President Reagan and Attorney General Edwin Meese appeared in the White House briefing room on short notice today, no one was prepared for their surprising announcements that money from the controversial Iran arms deal was secretly funneled to the Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government of Nicaragua. According to Attorney General Edwin Meese, Admiral John Poindexter, director of the National Security Council, knew about the secret transfer of money, and one of his deputies, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, arranged it. Poindexter resigned. North was fired. For his part, the president said he was not informed of North's scheme. And at the White House tonight, NBC's Chris Wallace has more on these unexpected developments. Chris?
Tom, officials here are calling it the worst scandal of the Reagan presidency, jeopardizing his policy in the Mideast and now Central America, and costing him a top advisor. The president was still maintaining today that his Iranian arms deal was not a mistake. But he said that over the weekend, the Justice Department uncovered one operation he had not known about, which led to Poindexter's resignation and North's dismissal.
The information brought to my attention yesterday convinced me that in one aspect, implementation of that policy was seriously flawed.
The president refused to say what the flaw was, leaving that to Attorney General Meese. And what Meese described was a scheme devised by North to get around the congressional ban against military aid to the Contras, then in effect. This year, he said, the U.S. sent $12 million in weapons to Israel, which Israeli agents then sold to Iran for much higher prices, $10 to $30 million more. The Israelis paid the $12 million back to the U.S., but transferred the extra money to Swiss bank accounts controlled by the Contras.
The only persons in the United States government that knew precisely about this, the only person was Lieutenant Colonel North. Admiral Poindexter did know that something of this nature was occurring, but he did not look into it further.
The Attorney General said later former National Security Advisor McFarlane had also been aware of the scheme. But Meese maintained involvement did not go any higher, that the President, Vice President Bush, Chief of Staff Reagan, Secretary of State Shultz, and CIA Director Casey all did not know of the plan. Meese did not explain how a Marine lieutenant colonel on his own could have arranged a deal involving 3 countries and millions of dollars, or why an admiral known for playing by the bureaucratic rules would not have told superiors. Meese said he's looking into whether any laws have been broken, and a blue ribbon panel will review NSC operations. But Poindexter's wife said he and North did nothing to embarrass the government.
That his decision to resign was to assist the president in continuing on with reforming the country, and I don't think they're being made a scapegoat by anybody.
White House officials hope today's action will satisfy demands for a staff shakeup. But there is continuing bitterness inside the administration toward Shultz for distancing himself from Mr. Reagan. And Meese hinted Shultz could be next.
I think anyone who is a member of the President's staff or the President's cabinet has an obligation either to support the policy decisions of the President or to get out.
But the biggest worry here tonight is just how far the Iranian operation went. Because after today's extraordinary events, many officials here are concerned. Whether there's anything, they still don't know.
Tonight, the international spy scandal with an Australian connection, and later we'll talk to South Africa's Foreign Minister Pik Botha, a man on a mission to improve relations between Canberra and Pretoria. It's a spy scandal that's already rocked the White House, an intrigue that could threaten the presidency of George Bush. This story centres on incredible allegations of spying on a scale never before imagined. It involves America's Central Intelligence Agency selling computer programs to foreign nations. These programs allegedly allowed the CIA to spy on the intelligence agencies that bought it. And one of the purchasers was Australia. We've been able to track down 2 key witnesses to those dealings, witnesses who are now in fear of their lives. Michael Holmes reports.
It may be the most bizarre spy story ever. A story of corruption and betrayal at the highest levels of the American government. A story of hostages used as pawns. Of the CIA spying on its friends. Of murders made to look like suicides.
I think it's about time to get the whole story out.
His name is Ari Ben-Menashe. He's a former Israeli intelligence agent.
Once it's out, there's no reason to hurt me physically anymore.
And today, he is hiding in Australia, in fear, he says, of his life.
So many people in the last 10 years who were working for the various governments on these issues, due to cover-ups, died mysteriously.
He claims the United States tried to spy on ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, by selling it a computer program that contained a hidden keyhole, a lock for which the CIA had a master key. The computer software is called Promise. It's designed to track millions of pieces of information on tens of thousands of people. And it's alleged to have been installed in dozens of government departments and security agencies around the world. It's also alleged that American intelligence made some small modifications to the program, modifications that enabled it to key in a special access code and gain entry to all the information on the computer.
Would be equivalent to going into ASIO and reading the handwritten files of all the agents, except the computer has them neatly organized and typed and instantly indexed, so it's much more convenient.
Bill Hamilton owns Inslaw, the company that developed PROMIS and offered it to the American government.
They would not have bothered to sell it to all these countries without first preparing it in such a way that it would be an easier avenue of penetration into the files of these foreign governments.
The whole story might never have emerged but for the fact that the American government didn't own PROMIS. It pirated the software from Bill Hamilton's company.
We were dumbfounded, couldn't conceive of it.
Hamilton's contract with the US Department of Justice to supply the PROMIS software was cancelled in 1982 without any real explanation. Only some time later did Hamilton hear that his software was turning up all over the world.
I don't know how much Australia paid. I've been told that Israel paid $5.5 million.
Ari Ben-Menashe confirms that PROMIS was sold to Israel, but claims the Israelis, unlike the Australians, were in on the secret.
The whole idea was that we would study it, the Americans then would sell it to our neighbors, and then we could, by using telephone lines, get into their our neighbors' computers. But then our American friends just took it a step further. They sold it to their allies as well, including Australia.
The list of countries which allegedly bought the PROMIS software reads like a who's who of America's friends, as well as its most bitter enemies.
Is spying on your friends considered a fair thing to do in the intelligence world?
Oh, it is. It's always done. Using a Trojan horse to go inside the agency, that gets a little aggressive, you know.
It all sounds a bit too bizarre to be true, but we've now been able to track down a key witness to a prison near Seattle in Washington state.
So you are 100% sure that PROMIS or a derivative of PROMIS was bought by Australia to be used in our intelligence and law enforcement
agencies?
Absolutely,
because I spent several thousand man-hours of programming time with a programming team, developing that subset.
This unlikely-looking character is a computer genius. His name is Michael Riconosciuto, and he says he was in charge of modifying the PROMIS program so that it could be accessed by American intelligence.
So whoever was holding that master key could do what?
Basically break into it and spy.
ASIO says it doesn't have and has never had the PROMIS software. Of course, it won't go into any detail about what sort of computer programs it does have, which is very handy because, according to Michael Riconosciuto, the PROMIS software was often altered and given different names before it was sold. Indeed, Riconosciuto claims he specifically modified the program for Australia at the request of ASIO.
I basically had to change the communications protocol, which is how that software package interacts with other software packages already resident in the computer system.
In a federal court hearing, Judge George Basin ruled the Justice Department had used illegal and underhanded methods to bankrupt Bill Hamilton's Inslaw company. He ordered the government to pay Inslaw $8 million. Trickery, fraud and deceit. You use those words when describing how the Justice Department stole the software. Do you stand by those words?
Yes. There's no question in my mind about it. The evidence was overwhelming.
So why was the Justice Department so desperate to get the software from Bill Hamilton? To answer that, you have to go back to 1980. Iran had seized American hostages.
All evidence proves that these people are spies.
If President Carter could secure their release, he'd have a big advantage in the upcoming US elections.
My thoughts and my prayers for our hostages in Iran are as though they were my own sons and daughters.
It's now alleged that the Reagan campaign made a deal with the Iranians, a deal to keep the hostages until after the election, thus denying Carter the credit for their freedom. The man alleged to have helped organise this deal is a Reagan political crony called Earl Bryan, and his payoff 3 years later on the promised software. About an hour and a half outside Washington, D.C., you'll find this place, Earl Bryan's multi-million-dollar country estate. If you believe Michael Riconosciuto, it's the house Promise bought. Now, we'd like to bring you Earl Bryan personally denying that claim, but he's not being interviewed by anybody. All we got was this letter from his lawyers threatening action if we so much as associate Earl Bryan's name with this story.
He had the contacts to help make sure that certain elements in Iran would not make a deal with President Carter.
This is from Glenn Greenwald over at The Intercept. The FBI informant who monitored the Trump campaign, Stefan Helper, oversaw a CIA spying operation in the 1980 presidential election. So this guy, Stefan Helper, so he worked for Nixon, and he was very close to George Herbert Walker Bush, and he spied on the Carter campaign for the Republicans. Well, here, 4 decades ago, Helper was responsible for a long-forgotten spying scandal involving the 1980 election in which Reagan campaign, using CIA officials managed by Helper, reportedly under the direction of former CIA director and then vice presidential candidate George Herbert Walker Bush, got caught running a spy operation from inside the Carter administration. Now, they would say you're a conspiracy theorist for saying this fact, right? Again, the moon landing being faked is a conspiracy theory. The CIA and the government lying to you nonstop is fact. Okay? All right. The plot involved CIA operatives passing classified information about Carter's foreign policy to Reagan campaign officials in order to ensure the Reagan campaign knew of any foreign policy decisions that Carter was considering. So this sounds like the deep state, CIA, getting involved with trying to swing an election. This is what they're now accusing Twitter bots from Russia doing. Somehow they swung the election. But literally, here we are. We have the CIA literally doing this. And, well, in response, the Department of Justice and the FBI's various media spokespeople did not deny the core accusation, but quibbled with the language. The FBI used an informant, not a spy. This is about the Trump administration. And then they began using increasingly strident language to warn that exposing his name would jeopardize his life and those of others, and also put Americans' national security at grave risk. So when it became known that this happened, that the FBI put a guy inside the Trump campaign to try to spy on them, they started saying, you better not release his name. The news media better not release his name, because if you do, that's a crime and people are going to die because of it, right? And, well, here we go. On May 8th, the Washington Post described the informant as a, quote, a top-secret intelligence source, and cited Department of Justice officials as arguing that disclosure of his name could risk the lives by potentially exposing the source, a U.S. citizen who has provided intelligence to the CIA and FBI. So they're trying to, by the way, Glenn Greenwald and other people at the Daily Caller was able to figure out who this guy was very easily. So it wasn't like they were really keeping it secret. So the New York Times, the Washington Post wrote stories about this. They didn't name Helper, but they gave every piece of evidence you could possibly want. And anybody who knows anything about him or anything would know exactly who it was. They did. They did. They knew who it was. And so Glenn writes about this, like, why, what, it's suspicious that they're trying to cover up who he was. So Helper's history is quite troubling, particularly his central role in the scandal in 1980 election. Equally troubling are the Department of Justice and the FBI's highly inflammatory and, at best, misleading claims that they made to try to prevent Helper's identity from being reported. So now they're lying. So now, again, the FBI and the Department of Justice are lying to you, the citizen, about meddling in a presidential election. And they're lying about keeping that guy's identity secret. Sources identified Stefan Helper, a campaign aide involved in providing 24-hour news updates and policy ideas to the traveling Reagan party. That's what he did back in 1980. As the person in charge, Helper is now 73, had also worked with Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Alexander Haig as part of the Nixon administration. That's some more, so you know who this guy is. And in 1980, the Washington Post published an article reporting on the extremely unusual and quite aggressive involvement of the CIA in the 1980 presidential campaign. Quote, simply put, no presidential campaign in recent memory, perhaps ever, has attracted as much support from the intelligence community as the campaign of former CIA Director George Bush. That also happened this past time. We did stories on it, how Hadley, the guy from the CIA, has come out publicly endorsing Hillary Clinton. You remember this? We did that story. And he said he's breaking protocol to do this because it's so important we keep Donald Trump out, because they were afraid Donald Trump was going to be anti-establishment. Turns out he's not at all. But they were afraid he might be. So look what they did there. So they did that. So that's back in 1980. That's the deep state being involved in a presidential election. And they say we need to worry about Russia screwing with our elections. And here it is, our own intelligence community screwing over the will of the American people. To begin with, the New York Times reported in December of last year that the FBI investigation into possible tests, so there's lots of questions surrounding why they lied, the timeline of when this actually happened, and why the news agencies are covering up for him. To begin with, the New York Times reported in December of last year that the FBI investigation into possible ties between the Trump campaign and Russia began when George Papadopoulos drunkenly boasted to an Australian diplomat about Russian dirt on Hillary Clinton. It was the disclosure of this episode by the Australians that, quote, led the FBI to open an investigation in July 2016 into Russia's attempts to disrupt the election and whether any of President Trump's associated conspired, the New York Times claimed. But now it seems clear that Helper's attempt to gather information for the FBI began before that. The professor's interactions with Trump advisors began a few weeks before the opening of the investigation when Page met the professor at the British Symposium. While it is not rare for the FBI to gather information before formally opening an investigation, Helper's earlier snooping does call into question the accuracy of the New York Times claim that it was the drunken Papadopoulos ramblings that first prompted the FBI's interest into these possible connections. So let's back up just a second. So the guy who we know was involved in a scandal spying on the Carter's campaign, who, by the way, was president, and then gave that classified information to another campaign. That guy should be in prison. That guy should be in prison and made an example of, so that never happens again. I'm guessing that happens all the time now. And we only know about it now because Trump. So, and then also, why did the New York Times claim the timeline wrong? Why did they? Well, because they're stenographers to power and they just say whatever the intelligence agencies tell them. And Glenn says it also suggests that the CIA operatives, apparently working with at least some factions within the FBI, were trying to gather information about the Trump campaign earlier than had been previously reported. Whatever else is true, the CIA operative and the FBI informant used to gather information on the Trump campaign in the 2016 campaign has, for weeks, been falsely depicted as a sensitive intelligence asset rather than what he actually is. A longtime CIA operative with extensive links to the Bush family, who was also responsible for a dirty and likely illegal spying operation in the 1980 presidential election. And that's why they were covering up for him. That's why they were threatening people. You better not ever release this guy's name, because if they did release that guy's name, we'd know that that guy's dirty. We know that guy's a dirty spy who already spied on one presidential campaign illegally. For that reason, it's easy to understand why many people in Washington were so desperate to conceal his identity. But that desperation had nothing to do with the lofty and noble concerns for national security they claimed were motive. So they're lying again. And you know who else was helping lying? Was Mark Warner, who's a senator, Democratic senator. Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, warns that it's potentially illegal to identify an FBI source in an attempt to undercut the Russia probe. So he's trying to scare people into letting you know that this is all BS. That's a senator, the head of the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, is again lying and gaslighting the American people at the behest of the deep state. And what did I say? Immediately after supporting a torturing war criminal to head the U.S. intelligence agency, the CIA, Mark Warner is worried about things being potentially illegal. So there you go. I don't know how other people are reporting this, but everything looks just as scummy as you could possibly think. Guess who's just as scummy as Donald Trump? The CIA and the FBI.
In 1980, so that President Carter could not recover in the polls and that Reagan would win the election.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that
Just 5 minutes after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, Iran announced that the hostages would be released.
some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
And the story doesn't end there. In a moment, the murders that have been linked to the spy scandal. There are many shady characters in this story. Spies, former spies, people with something to hide. But there are players with impeccable credentials too. In part 2 of this investigation, we meet a man whose background more than qualifies him to know a scandal when he smells one.
What is being said about this conspiracy points to criminal conduct much worse than anything in Watergate.
And Elliot Richardson should know. 17 years ago, he resigned as US Attorney General on a matter of principle after clashing with Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. Today, Richardson is legal counsel for Inslaw, and once again, he has the White House in his sights.
It might be reluctant to have it emerge that the U.S. government had, through clandestine means, planted software on foreign intelligence agencies so that the U.S. would be better able, as the phrase goes, to read their mail.
The number of murders that have occurred to prevent leaks are incredible. There's nearly 50 murders that can be directly ascribed to this pattern of activity.
The Promise affair and the allegation that Ronald Reagan and George Bush made a deal for the hostages to be kept until after the 1980 election were being investigated by journalist and author Danny Casolaro.
He said he had it. He had some already, and he was going to West Virginia to meet the source who had given him that evidence This source was now, he said, going to supply additional conclusive proof.
But Danny Casolaro never got to reveal either his source or the hard evidence he said was going to break the scandal wide open. On August the 10th, his body was found in this hotel room in West Virginia. His wrists had been slashed an incredible 12 times. Danny Casolaro's body was found naked in a pool of bloody water in the bathtub. All his papers were gone. Within hours, local police had declared the death a suicide.
You have a case of forensic artistry, you know, shall we say, where you have professionally trained people that set up a crime scene and they make it phenomenally difficult for investigators to backtrack, make a murder look like a suicide.
His body was embalmed by Monday morning by the time we found out. That is against the law in West Virginia. His body was embalmed without family consent. That certainly makes an autopsy a little more difficult.
Tony Casolaro says his brother Danny, pictured here at a nephew's birthday, just wasn't the suicidal type.
He was describing for me a few weeks before he died what he was doing and some of the people involved. And he said a lot of accidents had happened to people who were working on the things that he had been working on. He said, you know, if an accident happens to me, don't believe it.
But bad things seem to happen to people who make waves in the Inslaw affair. Earlier this year, Michael Riconosciuto contacted Bill Hamilton and signed a sworn affidavit for Hamilton's lawsuit against the Justice Department. Do you believe Michael Riconosciuto did alter the software as he claimed he did?
Yes, I do.
Almost immediately, Riconosciuto was contacted by a Justice Department official and given a very clear message.
Back off or else.
Less than 2 weeks after that threat, Michael Riconosciuto was arrested on drug charges.
My main concern right now is staying alive and protecting my family.
Right.
And remember Judge Basin, who found in favor of Inslaw against the Justice Department.
Right.
Well, a few months later, Judge Basin's reappointment to the bench, thought to be a formality, was blocked by the Justice Department.
Yeah.
His career has been destroyed. Would you still be a judge if you hadn't handed down the decision you did?
I think I would be. I rendered the, quote, wrong decision in the case of Inslaw versus Department of Justice.
Your replacement in the bankruptcy court was a lawyer who argued for the Justice Department in this case.
Yes.
Does that smell? Is that worthy of...
It's certainly an odd coincidence, isn't it?
Every time you figuratively pick up a rock, in this case, you find maggots under it.
Michael Holmes reporting on the saga that is now the subject of a U.S. congressional inquiry. Next up, South Africa's
Attorney General Elliot Richardson, who now represents Inslaw, says there's only one way to find the truth.
If there was not enough reason before to justify a full-scale, all-out, hard-hitting, impartial federal investigation, the case for doing that now is overwhelming.
Former Attorney General Ed Meese disagrees.
The question is whether there's any legal basis for it, and I think the people who have looked into it, including Attorney General Thornburg, have indicated there is no basis for it. And I would certainly have more confidence in Mr. Thornburg's judgment as an impartial person on the subject than I would Mr. Richardson, who's obviously a partisan and represents one of the parties.
A House subcommittee led by Congressman Jack Brooks has been investigating the Inslaw case for 2 years. Brooks has accused the Justice Department of stonewalling the committee's investigation by refusing for 2 years to release more than 400 documents relating to Inslaw. Faced with a subpoena, Attorney General Dick Thornburg finally produced some documents this summer, but told committee investigators some were either lost or stolen. Even President Bush is being questioned about Inslaw.
They're fairly soon, I'd say. The Inslaw case, Mr. President. The Inslaw case. Are you going to
I know his views on that. He doesn't have to explain. I know. What was the last?
The Justice Department says it has been able to reconstruct 90% of the missing documents. But a source close to the Brooks Committee says there's no way to tell how many documents are missing or how important they are to solving the mysterious Inslaw case.
Guns, drugs, and the CIA.
This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. Two of the most persistent offensives of the Reagan presidency have been the war against communism in Central America and the war on drugs here at home. But investigations of America's secret war in Nicaragua have revealed mounting evidence that the Central Intelligence Agency has been fighting the Contra war with the help of international drug traffickers. It is not a new story. Tonight's Frontline investigation traces the CIA's involvement with drug lords back to the agency's birth following World War II. It is a long history that asks this question. In the war on drugs, which side is the CIA on? Our program was produced by Leslie and Andrew Coburn. It is called Guns, Drugs, and the CIA, and is reported by Leslie Coburn.
Illegal drugs are one thing no community in America can, should, or needs to tolerate. America's already starting to take that message to heart. That's why I believe the tide of battle has turned, and we're beginning to win the crusade for a drug-free America.
Subcommittee on Narcotics, Terrorism, International Operations will come to order. From what we have learned these past months, our declaration on war against drugs seems to have produced a war of words and not action. Our borders are inundated with more narcotics than at any time ever before. It seems as though stopping drug trafficking in the United States has been a secondary U.S. foreign policy objective, sacrificed repeatedly for other political and institutional goals, such as changing the government of Nicaragua, supporting the government of Panama, using drug-running organizations as intelligence assets, and protecting military and intelligence sources from possible compromise through involvement in drug trafficking.
If we start with the premise that drug trafficking is morally reprehensible, our government agencies are not supposed to do anything like that, but they deal in a practical world.
Would you raise your right hand, please?
Ramon Milian Rodriguez saw that world as the chief accountant of the Colombian cocaine cartel, responsible for managing $11 billion in drug profits. Now serving a 43-year sentence for money laundering, he has been a key witness for a Senate investigation probing links between drugs and the CIA.
Let's say, for instance, a drug group was involved in a war with a terrorist group, a communist terrorist group. Well, it would behoove the CIA to give that drug group as much help and advice as possible so they could win their little war.
The history of the CIA runs parallel to criminal and drug operations throughout the world, but it's coincidental.
Victor Marchetti came to know the world of covert operations as a longtime CIA officer. He is the highest-ranking agency official ever to go public about what he learned.
It goes all the way back to the predecessor organization, OSS, and its involvement with the Italian mafia, La Cosa Nostra, in Sicily and southern Italy. Later on, when they were fighting the communists in France and that, they got in tight with the Corsican Brotherhood. The Corsican Brotherhood, of course, were big dope dealers. As things changed in the world, the CIA got involved with Kuomintang types in Burma who were drug runners because they were resisting the drift towards communism there. Same thing happened in Southeast Asia, later in Latin America. And some of the very people who are the best sources of information or who are capable of accomplishing things and the like happen to be the criminal element.
Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban-American, had been sent down from Miami.
It's the feeling that I see now in the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. I know their experience because I was left inside once, and I wanted to help them as much as I could.
Like Rodriguez, the Miami Cubans of Brigade 2506 are still ready to support the anti-communist cause, 30 years after their failed invasion of Cuba. They were willing recruits for the CIA's war against Nicaragua. The brigade supplied soldiers in the field, commanders, and fundraisers for the Contra cause. The brigade had been created and trained by the CIA for the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. After their defeat, the CIA continued to maintain and use this skilled force of covert operators wherever they were needed. Their numbers grew into the thousands. They had their own navy, as well as other assets provided by the CIA, including businesses and banks.
I was in charge.
Manuel Artime was the agency's favorite Cuban, handpicked to command both the Bay of Pigs and the covert operations that followed. In 1972, he recruited and arranged CIA training for a brilliant young accountant called Ramon Milian Rodriguez.
He ran covert operations out of Miami for the CIA.
So Artime had a whole group of people who were his people.
Oh yes, Artime ran a very large operation. It was very large. He was very active all over Central and South America.
A lot of Cubans go to work with the Central Intelligence Agency in foreign operations.
He was in charge of, among other things, the Watergate burglars and things like that.
Did you launder any money for the Watergate guys?
I made payments for the Watergate burglars, yes. I started out in life in one scandal, and I have ended it in another, it seems. After Watergate, the group that Manolo Artime was running in Miami was disbanded. The fact that the burglars were Cuban really hurt in Miami. So we had a situation where people were laid off. They were just given the assets. For instance, if you were running a print shop, you kept the print shop. If you had a boat, as there were many boats for surveillance and charges, you just kept the boats. And then that was really the starting off point where you got some well-trained people into the drug business.
Many Cubans worked for Artime in that time. Some of them have become very successful, good American citizens. Others have become gangsters.
But with a secret Contra war to fight, the agency was more interested in covert skills than good citizenship, particularly when it came to raising money. Ramon Milian Rodriguez was ideally placed. With access to the limitless resources of the Medellin cocaine cartel, he had no problem raising cash.
You've been a supporter living in the Cuban community, passionately anti-communist and anti-Castro. You've also been a supporter of the Contras, is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware of whether or not narcotics proceeds at some time may or may not have supported Contra efforts?
Yes, sir. Narcotics proceeds were used to shore up the Contra effort.
Did you personally play a role in some of the transfer of that money?
Yes, I did.
In 1984, when Congress cut off Contra funding, the White House turned to other sources for support. According to documents, Ramon Milian Rodriguez had been laundering foreign payments for the CIA up through 1982, at the same time as he was laundering cash for the cocaine cartel. He says the CIA turned to him again.
To have people like me in place that can be used is marvelous for them. The agency, and quite rightly so, has things that they have to do which they can never admit to an oversight committee, right? And the only way they can fund these things is through drug money or through illicit money that they can get their hands on in some way.
Was any of the money traceable to drugs or to drug-related transactions?
The money that we, you're talking about the money that we provided?
That's right.
No, sir.
And why was that?
Because we're experts at what we do.
Who's Ramon Milian Rodriguez?
He worked for the cartel.
So he was laundering money for the cartel?
Yes.
And he worked with Noriega?
Yes.
Until last year, Jose Blandón was General Manuel Noriega's head of political intelligence in Panama. He was a key U.S. government witness for the grand jury that indicted Noriega for drug trafficking. General Noriega was more than ready to support the Reagan administration in the Contra War after Congress cut off funding. How important was Noriega to the White House in the Contra resupply effort?
He played a key role in the supply of arms to the Contra.
So when various administration officials like Oliver North met with General Noriega, did they know that he was involved with narcotics trafficking?
I think that the United States had information that Noriega is involved in drugs since at least 8 years.
8 years?
So, yes, so they knew about that.
Were they just looking the other way on his drug trafficking?
The problem is that for the White House, I mean, for the administration, or the Reagan administration, Nicaragua was so important, and the focus of all the foreign policy of the United States in Central America was in Nicaragua and in the fight against the communists. So for them, drugs was something in second place.
Drugs took second place?
Yes.
Noriega's Contra support earned him powerful friends in Washington, including the CIA director, William Casey. Noriega was on his payroll at a reported $200,000 a year.
That was a very special relationship.
What kind of special relationship?
Well, Noriega talked with Casey. I have a list that I know more than 3 meetings. And always he's received the support of Casey.
What kind of support from Casey?
All kind of support, political support. So when somebody tried to investigate anything, the case stopped. Look, this is a very important piece in all this war.
So Casey would actually stop investigations of Noriega?
It's the men that helped Noriega very much.
According to Blandón, Noriega was not the only drug trafficker to reap the rewards of Contra support. The cocaine cartel also saw the advantages of backing U.S. policy.
That's the reason why the cartel of Medellin decided in 1983 to cooperate with the Contra.
So you're saying in 1983, the cartel started supporting the Contras?
Yes.
And the reason was because they knew that they could therefore get protection?
Yes.
How did they help them out? Was it arms plus cash, or was it just arms? How did that work?
They work in different ways. First, they established the network to supply arms, and also they pay in cash.
If one wants to organize an armed resistance or an armed undertaking for any purposes, the easy place to get the money and the easy places to get the guns are in the drug world.
General Paul Gorman was the commander of the U.S. Southern Command, based in Panama from 1982 to 1985.
The most ready source of money, big money, easy money, fast money, sure money, cash money, is the narcotics racket.
General Gorman was asked whether the Contras could have relied on drug cash.
Based on your knowledge of how it works and what you understood from your experience down there, it wouldn't surprise you.
Not at all, particularly if they'd been on somebody's payroll and had their funds cut off. It would be the natural recourse of those people.
How much money was actually contributed by you or through you for the Contras, total?
It was a little under $10 million.
I presume it wasn't all sent in one suitcase.
Oh, no. It was delivered on a per-need basis. You know, they'd say we need so much at such a location, and we take care of the logistics of it.
Milian Rodriguez says he used a series of Cuban-controlled front companies in Miami and Costa Rica to funnel the $10 million to the Contra cause. These fronts range from banks to obscure fish companies, located in out-of-the-way Miami shopping centers or in provincial port towns in Costa Rica. The route for the drug cash was carefully disguised.
Are you familiar with the name of a company called Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas?
Yes, sir, I am.
What is that company?
Well, it's a shrimp processing warehouse, but more importantly, it was one of the fronts that we used.
Did you set it up? What role did you play in it?
I was a key person in setting up the interlocking chain of companies around Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas.
Were payments or arrangements made by which the Contras could receive money through Frigoríficos?
Yes, sir. If you add up what it costs to run the Contra operation, and you get to a bottom line figure, and you deduct from that the known sources, you're going to have a tremendous deficit. And I think the question's got to be where the deficit, how was the deficit taken care of?
There was a deficit.
Yes.
They realized that.
And we took care of it.
I've been spending some time looking at the numbers here of the amount of aid that the Contras were getting at various times. And I come to the conclusion that we're missing something. That there's got to be another source of funding for the Contras other than those which this committee has so far identified.
Last summer, the Iran-Contra committees were aware that there had been an unacknowledged source of money from somewhere.
I think there's got to be some other source of funds that meaning this committee has not yet uncovered.
Well, I don't think I can help you there. I don't know of anything else.
The war cost so much every day.
Mm-hmm.
They were getting a certain amount, thanks to you, through Switzerland.
And many others, yes.
And many others. But the war cost more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea how much more it cost?
Well, I think Director Casey asked me a similar question in the spring of '86, I think it was. And I told him that I thought that the Contra effort would need a minimum of $10 million over the next 3 months, over and above the monies that we could apply, in order to hang in there through the summer months until the Congress would act. There was some expectation in the White House, I guess, and in the state that the Congress would act much sooner than they acted. Things were going downhill rapidly.
The people who received this money, were they aware of the fact that this was drug money, the proceeds came from drug money?
Let's put it like this, Senator DeMauro, the Contra peasant in the field did not, but the men who made the contact with me did. At that time, I was under indictment. I mean, I was red hot.
His arrest was well publicized. The $5 million seized with him brought Vice President Bush to Miami to pose with what the money launderer termed his petty cash.
Did Ramon Millian Rodriguez have any friends who were working in the Contra resupply network?
Yes.
Who would that have been?
Felix Rodriguez.
Felix Rodriguez.
Yes.
A veteran of the Artime organization and the CIA, Felix Rodriguez was a key member of the White House resupply network. The Senate was told by the money launderer that it was Felix Rodriguez who solicited the drug cash.
If you have a fellow that's a tremendous patriot like Felix Rodriguez, who has sacrificed his personal needs for the cause of fighting communism, and all of a sudden he finds himself in a position where his troops are going to run out of money. They won't have money for bullets, for food, for medicine. I think in the case of Felix, it might have been something done out of desperation. They had to get money, and they were willing to get it from any source to continue their war.
When they go on the offense, they burn up a lot of ammunition, weapons, need a lot of air resupply, radios, uniforms, boots, food, all this stuff. You know, the cost just goes up.
Well, there are allegations that that Felix Rodriguez was desperately trying to make up that deficit.
If he was, it certainly didn't come to our attention. Not at all.
So you had no knowledge of it?
No, not at all.
Well, the allegations are that he tried to make up the deficit by soliciting money from drug traffickers in Florida.
Well, I thought you were circling back to that, but certainly we didn't hear anything like that at the time. As I said, Felix is no friend of mine, but I'd be astonished if he were involved with drug traffickers. I really would.
When General Noriega told you that Felix Rodriguez was friendly with Ramon Milian Rodriguez, were you surprised to hear that Felix Rodriguez would be involved with a drug trafficker?
Surprised? Why?
According to Blandón, while Felix Rodriguez was supplying the Contras from Ilopango, he was receiving arms shipments arranged with the help of this man, Mike Harari, a former Israeli intelligence agent and a key aide to General Noriega. Harari, says Blandón, was also in business with the cocaine cartel, using the same network to ship arms and drugs, all with the sanction of the CIA. Did he get involved with narcotics trafficking in the course of helping to supply the Contras with weapons?
Yes, that was part of the business.
So he was moving cocaine
Yes.
from Colombia to the United States?
No. They moved the cocaine from Colombia to Panama, to the airstrip in Costa Rica or Honduras to the United States.
At the same time that he was gathering up arms for the Contras?
Yes.
Where were the arms coming from?
From Yugoslavia and from the East Bloc, the communist countries.
From 1983 to 1985, says Blandón, this network, supported by Israeli and U.S. intelligence, was a major source of arms for the Contras.
Harari, the Israeli who was working with Noriega, was working with Felix Rodriguez.
Yes.
And Harari at the same time was involved with drug trafficking.
Yes.
Who was Felix Rodriguez working for or with when he approached you?
Well, the only government mention that he made was Vice President Bush.
And what was his relationship with Bush as you understood it?
He was reporting directly to Bush. I was led to believe he was reporting regularly to the Vice President.
He was in touch with the VP's office on a number of occasions. I really don't know. I've never understood that relationship.
The request for the contribution made a lot more sense because Felix was reporting to George Bush. If Felix had come to me and said, I'm reporting to anyone else, let's say, Oliver North, I might have been more skeptical. I didn't know who Oliver North was, and I didn't know his background. But, if you have and let's say we'll call him an ex-CIA operative, even though it's not true, he's a current operative.
Who is?
Felix. Everyone says he's ex-CIA. Well, he's
Felix Rodriguez.
Yeah, there's nothing ex about him. But if you have a CIA, what you consider to be a CIA man, coming to you saying, I want to fight this war, we're out of funds, can you help us out? I'm reporting directly to Bush on it. I mean, it's very real, very believable. Here you have a CIA guy reporting to his old boss.
This February 1985 memo from General Paul Gorman confirms that Bush and the Cuban had known each other for years, and that Rodriguez's primary responsibility was Nicaragua and the Contra FDN forces. Rodriguez, quote, is operating as a private citizen, but his acquaintanceship with the vice president is real enough, going back to the latter's days as director of Central Intelligence. Rodriguez's primary commitment to the region is in Nicaragua, where he wants to assist the FDN.
Did you say anything to Vice President Bush about your activities on behalf of this resupply operation?
No, sir, not to him or anyone on his staff.
But when Hasenfuss was shot down, the first call that Rodriguez made from Central America was to a staffer of Vice President Bush. Questions about that call forced the Bush office to put out a summary, listing 17 meetings with Rodriguez, including 3 with Bush himself. Nevertheless, the vice president has insisted that these contacts with Rodriguez concerned only El Salvador, not the Contras.
He wasn't selling drugs. He was just raising money. Tainted money, granted, but for a very good cause.
Felix Rodriguez claims he met with the cartel's money launderer only once and never solicited cash.
We permitted narcotics. I mean, we were complicitous as a country in narcotics traffic at the same time as we're spending countless dollars in this country to try to get rid of this problem. It's mind-boggling.
Is the war on drugs a big priority in this country, really?
Oh, no. No, it's largely a joke. There is no war on drugs. No president who's ever announced one has ever fought one. And no president who's ever announced one has ever given the soldiers the ammunition with which to fight one.
The intelligence agencies of this country, by God, should be involved in this battle instead of working with the scum of the earth, which they've been doing. They should be involved in this battle as a crusade for the survival of this country and this hemisphere.
I don't know if we've got the worst intelligence system in the world. I don't know if we've got the best and they knew it all and just overlooked it. But no matter how you look at it, something's wrong. Something is really wrong out there.
Now, you can deny U.S. government involvement in drugs all you want, but the patterns are there, and the players are there popping up again, and you know, eventually someone is going to realize what the truth is.
This summer, both Ramon Milian Rodriguez and Felix Rodriguez are expected to testify publicly in front of Senator Kerry's committee about the drug cartel's alleged $10 million contribution to the Contras. Vice President Bush declined to be interviewed for this program or to reply to Frontline's written questions about his relationship with Felix Rodriguez.
Here are the facts. In August of 1991, the corpse of journalist Danny Casolaro was found in the tub of Sheraton Hotel's room 517 in Martinsburg, West Virginia. He had 10 to 12 slash wounds on his wrist. Investigators also found a suicide note nearby. Coroners twice ruled the death a suicide. However, Casolaro's family believed there was more to the story. In the time leading up to his death, Danny Casolaro had become increasingly panicked. He told his brother that anonymous callers harassed and threatened him on the phone, which his housekeeper confirmed. Casolaro also told his confidants that if he died, it would not be a suicide. Instead, he implied, it would have something to do with his latest investigation, a massive conspiracy of silence touching on everything from surveillance software to the October surprise, Iran-Contra, and more, bridging generations and reaching all the way to the White House. Danny Casolaro called this conspiracy the Octopus. Here's where it gets crazy. Today, most people have not heard of Danny Casolaro. What was he working on? What happened to him on the night of his death? According to witnesses, he was traveling to Martinsburg to meet with a contact, possibly regarding the now obscure Inslaw case. In the 1970s, an IT company named Inslaw developed a people tracking program called the Prosecutor's Management Information System, or PROMIS, a data mining tracking system easily decades ahead of its time. The deal went sour, and Inslaw eventually took the Department of Justice to court, alleging that the United States did not honor the contract. Inslaw argued that the government pirated this software, sold it to other countries, and tried to bankrupt and silence their company to stop the truth from getting out. In contentious congressional proceedings, compelling evidence emerged to support these claims. As time passed, more and more witnesses came forth, including former Mossad Deputy Director Rafael Itan, who claimed that U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies cooperated to sell a Trojan horse version of PROMIS to foreign governments. It's possible that Casolaro's investigation began here, but soon he stumbled into what he believed was an international web of espionage, assassination, drugs, illegal weapon trades, and more. He traced the ringleaders to the upper reaches of private security firms, the CIA, and the Reagan-era White House. Today, questions about the events persist and remain unanswered. Theorists have drawn increasingly complicated links between events alleged to be part of the Octopus, but how much of this is mere conjecture? It's common knowledge that the world's intelligence agencies have and will murder to keep secrets. But did they murder Danny Casolaro, or did he commit suicide? Numerous people, including former congressmen and other journalists, don't believe the official story. And, more than 20 years later, questions remain.
Do you have any direct knowledge that Clinton was aware of the drug operation coming into Arkansas?
The direct knowledge is that Buddy Young was actually a advisor to Clinton. He was his chief of security, and he was one on board the aircraft, and he was sent there by Clinton to investigate the loss of monies that had been determined. Additional direct knowledge comes in the fact that one of the people called by Barr was the governor of Arkansas on that SATCOM. He called North, he called the vice president on this 24th of March conversation, and he called the governor of Arkansas and talked to him. So, and governor of Arkansas then was William Jefferson Clinton. So they were talking about the enterprise, about the lost monies. And additionally, in earlier years, and when I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I actually flew several missions carrying medical coolers again with money and drugs in it into Arkansas.
Out of where, Fort Campbell?
Out of Fort Campbell. It was delivered to us by the 324th Med Battalion.
Out of the South America?
Out of South America. They were operating in the South America in Honduras. It was flown by C-130 to Fort Campbell. It was marked medical supplies. Donor organs, this particular one was marked. And we were advised to give it to Dr. Lassiter at Little Rock Air Force Base. So we flew it to Little Rock Air Force Base. I opened the coolers. I don't fly a cooler without opening it. I don't fly anything without opening it. Let me tell you why I don't fly coolers without opening them. I was told by Colby earlier that Torrijos died simply because they put a cooler marked donor organs on his aircraft that blew up in flight. So whenever I see a cooler, I open that cooler.
And what did you find in the cooler?
We found a large sum of money and 3 kilos of cocaine in one cooler. In the other cooler, we found all cocaine. Those 2 coolers were picked up by Dr. Lassiter, who actually ended up being, as we found out in later years, a man named Dan Lassiter, who was convicted for trafficking cocaine in Arkansas. However, he was pardoned by the then governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton.
And did you have any information that Clinton had direct knowledge of that? No, you flew him into Arkansas. Was Clinton there waiting for it, or was there a limousine there or anything like that?
We had to wait over an hour and a half for Dr. Lassiter to show up. But when he finally showed up, he showed up in an entourage of vehicles. There was a van, there was a stretch limo, and an unmarked police car. In the coming out of the stretch limo, Dr. Lassiter came forward. He had 2 people with him. One stayed at the car and one came over. He introduced the one that walked over to the aircraft to pick up the coolers as the governor of Arkansas. And the governor of Arkansas extended his hand, and that's the first time I shook the hand of William Jefferson Clinton.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.